When you look out across a vast, empty landscape, a sprawling desert or a jagged mountain range, it is easy to feel entirely isolated. The sheer scale of the earth can make human existence seem incredibly small and fragile. If you were to stand at the edge of the Gobi Desert today, feeling the dry wind pull at your clothes, you might think that such a formidable place was meant to keep people apart. The distances involved are so immense that they seem designed to act as permanent boundaries. But history shows us something entirely different. Instead of accepting these boundaries, humanity looked at the most imposing, unforgiving terrains on the planet and saw an invitation. They saw a challenge to be overcome, a space to be crossed, and a way to reach the unknown worlds that lay just beyond the horizon. This is Quiet Codex, a calm corner of YouTube dedicated to helping you wind down with fascinating facts and peaceful explorations of our shared past. Tonight, as you settle into wherever you happen to be, let the tension of the day begin to slip away. Let your breathing slow down. Let your thoughts drift gently, like the soft sand moving across an ancient dune. Because tonight, we are going to explore one of the greatest achievements of human endurance and connection. We are going to journey along the ancient caravan routes, traversing the formidable deserts and towering peaks of Asia, and discover the profound legacy of the Silk Roads. Before we begin our long journey, I would love to know where you are resting tonight. Whether you are curled up in bed, relaxing on a comfortable chair, or simply finding a quiet moment in a busy world, you are welcome here. If you enjoy these calm explorations, a like and a subscribe would truly help the channel continue to grow. And to everyone who is already part of our community, thank you so much for being here. Hopefully, this video is relaxing enough to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. So let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Let your mind settle into a quiet, steady rhythm. Together, we are going to walk alongside the ancient merchants, cross oceans of sand, and witness the beautiful, complicated exchange of cultures that shaped the modern world. Long before the concept of a global network existed, long before ships crossed the Atlantic or airplanes took to the sky, the world was connected by a fragile but resilient thread of paths. This network stretched across thousands of miles, linking the eastern edges of China with the Mediterranean Sea. It is famously known today as the Silk Road. The name itself, coined in the late 19th century by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen, evokes images of luxurious fabrics and exotic spices. But the reality of this network was far more profound and far more difficult than the romantic name suggests. It was not a single paved highway. It was a shifting, organic web of trails, mountain passes, and desert tracks. And it was built on the incredible courage and tenacity of generations of travelers. The origins of these routes stretch deep into antiquity, long before silk became the primary commodity of exchange. Even in the second millennium before the Common Era, ancient peoples were already forging paths across the harsh landscapes of Central Asia. They were driven by the search for precious materials that could not be found anywhere else. In the high, arid mountains of the Tarim Basin, near the cities of Khotan and Yarkand, miners extracted nephrite jade, a stone so highly valued in early Chinese culture that it was considered more precious than gold. This early jade trade established the preliminary arteries of connection, proving that the brutal geography of the region could be navigated by those with enough determination. But the formal opening of the network, the moment when the scattered paths were woven into a deliberate system of international trade, began with a single, extraordinary mission. In the year 138 before the Common Era, the Han Dynasty Emperor Wu dispatched a diplomat named Zhang Qian into the unknown Western territories. His mission was entirely political. The Han Empire was under constant threat from the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of nomadic warriors who dominated the northern steppes. Emperor Wu hoped that Zhang Qian could find a distant group called the Yuezhi and forge a military alliance to encircle the Xiongnu. Zhang Qian set out with a retinue of roughly 100 men, venturing into a landscape that was largely a mystery to the Chinese court. Almost immediately, his expedition ended in disaster. He was captured by the very Xiongnu forces he had been sent to bypass. For an agonizing 10 years, Zhang Qian was held as a prisoner. Yet, he never forgot his imperial orders. He learned the language of his captors, he observed their customs, and he waited. When the opportunity finally arose, he escaped, but he did not turn back toward the safety of home. Instead, he pushed further west, honoring his original mission. He crossed the freezing passes of the Pamir Mountains and descended into the fertile valleys of Bactria, located in what is now northern Afghanistan. When he finally arrived, he did not find the military alliance his emperor sought. The Yuezhi had settled into a comfortable agricultural life and had no interest in marching to war on the other side of the world. But Zhang Qian found something far more valuable. He found thriving markets filled with goods his people had never seen. He saw robust horses of incredible quality, agricultural products like alfalfa and grapes, and evidence of a vast, interconnected world stretching all the way to India and the Middle East. When Zhang Qian finally returned to the Han court, 13 years after he had first departed, he was a changed man, and he brought with him a wealth of intelligence. His detailed reports on the Western lands ignited a fire in the imagination of the Han leadership. They realized that beyond the dangerous steppes lay rich, sophisticated civilizations eager for trade. To protect these newly discovered economic possibilities, the Han dynasty extended the Great Wall westward, establishing fortified outposts along a narrow geographical bottleneck known as the Hexi Corridor. This immense military and infrastructural effort provided a safe harbor for the earliest merchant caravans, officially inaugurating the era of the Silk Roads. To understand how these staggering distances were conquered, we must look not just at the humans who walked the paths, but at the animals that made the journey possible. The geography of Central Asia is unforgiving. It is a land of extremes, where freezing winters give way to blistering summers, and where water is often separated by hundreds of miles of sterile rock and sand. Horses, while fast and powerful, required too much water and specific types of grazing grass to survive the deep desert crossings. Donkeys and mules were useful for shorter mountainous stretches, but they lacked the necessary stamina and carrying capacity for the longest legs of the journey. The true heroes of the overland trade, the creatures that became the undisputed ships of the desert, were the Bactrian camels. The Bactrian camel is a marvel of evolutionary engineering, perfectly adapted to the most hostile environments on Earth. Unlike the single-humped dromedary camels of the Arabian Peninsula, the Bactrian camel possesses two distinct humps. For centuries, a common misconception held that these humps were filled with water, a biological canteen for the long journey. In truth, the humps are massive reservoirs of fat. When food is scarce, which is almost always the case in the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts, the camel metabolizes this fat into energy and, through a complex chemical process, a small amount of metabolic water. A healthy, well-fed Bactrian camel has plump, upright humps. But after weeks of grueling travel with little nourishment, those humps become depleted, collapsing and flopping over the animal's back like deflated sacks. Their tolerance for extreme temperatures is nothing short of miraculous. A Bactrian camel can comfortably survive in the bitter cold of a Mongolian winter, where temperatures plunge to 29 degrees below 0 Celsius. They accomplish this by growing an incredibly thick, shaggy double coat that traps heat close to their bodies. When the seasons turn and the ferocious summer heat arrives, pushing temperatures toward 50 degrees Celsius, they shed this winter coat in massive, untidy clumps, preventing themselves from overheating. Water conservation is the camel's greatest trick. They can march for days, sometimes more than a week, without taking a single drink, drawing on their metabolic reserves and specialized kidneys to minimize moisture loss. But when they finally reach a rare desert oasis, their capacity for rehydration is staggering. A thirsty Bactrian camel can consume over 100 liters of water in just a few minutes, swelling like a sponge as their dehydrated tissues absorb the life-saving liquid. Every aspect of their anatomy is optimized for the desert. When the brutal sandstorms of the Taklamakan whip across the dunes, turning the air into an abrasive, suffocating fog, the camel simply lowers its head and keeps walking. Their nostrils are lined with specialized muscles that allow them to squeeze the nasal passages completely shut, blocking out the driving sand. Their eyes are protected by two thick rows of extraordinarily long eyelashes, and a third, translucent eyelid acts like a windshield wiper, sweeping debris away without blinding the animal. Even their feet are specialized. Instead of hard hooves, they have wide, leathery pads that act like snowshoes, distributing their immense weight so they can walk across soft, shifting sand without sinking. Without these magnificent, foul-tempered, incredibly resilient animals, The overland trade network simply could not have existed. They were the engines of the ancient world, carrying loads of up to 200 kilograms across terrains that would have killed almost any other beast of burden. But even with the strength of the Bactrian camel, the journey was perilous beyond description. The routes were entirely dictated by the unforgiving geography of the land. After departing the relative safety of the Han capital, Chang'an, and traversing the narrow, fortified stretch of the Hexi corridor, the caravans arrived at the edge of the Tarim Basin. Here, they faced the most terrifying obstacle of the entire journey: the Taklamakan Desert. The name itself is steeped in dark legends, often translated loosely by locals as the place where you go in, but you never come out. It is one of the largest sandy deserts in the world, a vast, desolate ocean of shifting dunes that covers an area roughly the size of Germany. The conditions within the Taklamakan are incredibly hostile. It sits in a rain shadow created by the towering peaks of the Himalayas, the Kunlun, and the Tian Shan mountain ranges, meaning it receives almost zero precipitation. The dunes here are not small, stationary mounds of sand. They are massive, towering structures that can reach up to 300 meters in height, and they are constantly reshaped by the wind. Attempting to cross the center of the Taklamakan was considered a death sentence. There were no permanent landmarks, no reliable sources of water, and no shelter from the elements. A caravan that lost its way in the interior would simply vanish, swallowed by the shifting sands, leaving no trace behind. Because of this absolute lethality, the trade routes were forced to split, forming a northern rim and a southern rim that hugged the edges of the desert, clinging desperately to a chain of small oasis towns fed by glacial runoff from the surrounding mountains. The environmental hazards were constant. During the summer, the surface temperature of the sand could exceed 70 degrees Celsius, hot enough to severely burn the feet of anyone foolish enough to walk without heavy protection. In the winter, the biting cold swept down from the high altitudes, freezing travelers in their tracks. But the most terrifying danger of the Taklamakan was the wind. The desert is infamous for its sudden, violent sandstorms. These storms could blot out the sun entirely, turning day into night and reducing visibility to absolutely zero. The wind carried not just fine dust, but heavier pebbles and rocks that could inflict serious injuries on both humans and animals. When a storm struck, there was nothing to do but command the camels to lie down. Huddle against their massive bodies, cover your face, and pray that the wind would pass before you were buried alive. The isolation of the desert routes created an intense psychological pressure. Travelers knew that if they fell sick, if an animal went lame, or if they missed the next oasis, there was no possibility of rescue. The wilderness was absolute. It is easy to imagine the deep, unsettling quiet of the desert night, the cold stars burning intensely above the black dunes, and the realization that you are entirely alone, suspended between the safety of the last town and the hope of the next. Because of these extreme dangers, merchants rarely traveled alone. The fundamental unit of commerce on the Silk Road was the caravan. To survive the elements and to deter the constant threat of banditry from nomadic raiders who preyed on isolated travelers, merchants banded together in massive groups. A single caravan could consist of anywhere from 50 to over 1,000 camels, stretching in a long, undulating line that vanished into the distant haze. The daily rhythm of a merchant caravan was dictated entirely by survival. In the deepest heat of the summer, traveling during the day was suicide. The intense sun would rapidly dehydrate the animals and exhaust the men. Instead, the caravan would make camp during the day, seeking whatever meager shade could be found and wait for the sun to set. As the deep blue of twilight settled over the desert, the camp would come alive. The camels would be loaded, a process that required immense skill to balance the heavy packs evenly, and the long march would begin. They moved through the darkness, relying on the stars for navigation and the cool night air to preserve their strength. In featureless stretches of sand, the caravan leaders would sometimes ride ahead, planting long wooden stakes in the ground to mark the correct path so the rest of the group would not wander off course in the dark. The journey was not a silent affair. Every camel in the line was tied to the one in front of it, and a large, heavy bell was attached to the harness of the very last animal. This bell served a critical purpose. As the caravan moved through the pitch-black night, the steady, rhythmic clanging of the bell reassured the leader at the front that the line was intact. If the ringing stopped, it meant the rope had snapped, a camel had collapsed, or thieves had quietly detached the rear animals. The sudden silence of the bell was the sound of disaster. The grueling pace of travel, covering perhaps 30 or 40 kilometers in a single day, was sustainable only because of a remarkable system of infrastructure that developed alongside the trade routes. In the middle of nowhere, surrounded by hostile environments, an exhausted merchant could look toward the horizon and see the thick, reassuring walls of a caravanserai. These structures were the beating heart of the Silk Road, providing a safe harbor where life could pause, recover, and exchange news before returning to the wilderness. A caravanserai was far more than just a simple inn. It was a highly fortified, self-contained community designed specifically to protect and serve the needs of passing trade. From the outside, they often looked like military fortresses. They were usually built in a square or rectangular shape, with high, thick walls made of mud, brick, or stone, designed to repel attacks from nomadic raiders. There was almost always only a single, heavy wooden gate, closely guarded at all times. This singular entrance ensured that once a caravan was inside, its valuable cargo and its people were safe from the chaos of the outside world. Passing through the massive gate, a traveler would enter a large, open central courtyard. The sudden contrast from the deadly quiet of the desert to the bustling, chaotic life of the courtyard must have been overwhelming. The air would be thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, animal sweat, and exotic spices. Around the perimeter of the courtyard were rows of arched alcoves and rooms, usually arranged on 2 levels. The ground floor was dedicated entirely to the animals and the cargo. There were stables for the horses and donkeys, massive open areas for the camels to rest, and secure, lockable warehouses where merchants could store their precious goods without fear of theft. The upper floors contained small Spartan sleeping quarters for the travelers, offering a rare chance to sleep on a mat instead of the hard desert ground. But the true magic of the caravanserai was not its architecture. It was the social environment it created. These isolated outposts were the most cosmopolitan places on earth. In the courtyard of a major caravanserai, you might find a Buddhist monk from India sharing a fire with a Nestorian Christian from Syria. You might hear the rapid, haggling tones of Persian merchants negotiating with Chinese silk traders. Because there was no central authority governing the entire length of the routes, trust was the only currency that truly mattered. And that trust was built here, over shared meals and warm fires. The caravanserai acted as a primitive news agency. Merchants arriving from the west would trade information with those heading east. They would share rumors about the condition of the mountain passes, the location of active bandit groups, the shifting political alliances of local warlords, and the current market prices for saffron or lapis lazuli in distant cities. Inside the walls, specialized professionals provided essential services. Blacksmiths repaired broken wagon wheels and forged new camel bells. Veterinarians tended to lame animals. Money changers, known as sarafs, sat in small booths, weighing silver and gold coins from a dozen different empires, facilitating the complex international transactions that kept the trade flowing. It was a vibrant, messy, and intensely alive space, a temporary city that existed purely for the sake of connection. Amongst all the diverse group that populated these way stations, one specific people dominated the overland trade for centuries. They were the Sogdians, an Iranian-speaking people originating from the region around the ancient cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, in modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. For hundreds of years, the Sogdians were the undisputed masters of the Silk Road. They did not conquer territories with vast armies or build massive empires based on military might. Instead, they built an empire of commerce. The Sogdians established a sprawling network of trading colonies that stretched from the borders of the Byzantine Empire all the way into the heart of Tang Dynasty China. They were so ubiquitous, so deeply entrenched in the mechanics of exchange that their language, Sogdian, became the lingua franca of the overland routes. If you wanted to do business anywhere between the Mediterranean and the Pacific, you had to speak at least a little Sogdian. We know an astonishing amount about the daily lives and anxieties of these merchants, thanks to a remarkable archaeological discovery. In the early 20th century, an explorer uncovered a cache of ancient documents hidden in the ruins of a Chinese watchtower near the desert oasis of Dunhuang. These documents, known as the Ancient Letters, were written by Sogdian merchants around the year 313. They were never delivered. They sat in the dry desert air for 1,600 years, perfectly preserved, waiting to tell their stories. Reading these letters is a profoundly humanizing experience. They do not speak of grand historical events or sweeping political changes. They speak of the mundane, stressful reality of trying to make a living on the edge of the world. One letter, written by a desperate woman named Mune, was addressed to her husband, who had left her in a trading colony to secure funds and had not returned for 3 years. She begs him to come back, detailing her crushing debts and the threat of being sold into slavery. Another letter is from a junior merchant writing to his wealthy investors back home, anxiously explaining why a particular shipment of spices was delayed and begging for more time to turn a profit. These letters strip away the romantic myth of the Silk Road and reveal the hard, uncompromising truth. The trade was driven by regular people taking immense personal risks, enduring years of separation from their families, all for the chance of securing a better life. And what were they risking their lives for? The sheer variety of goods moving across these ancient routes is staggering, but the commerce was not a simple exchange of one item for another. The Silk Road was a relay system. Very few merchants ever traveled the entire length of the network. A trader might buy a bolt of silk in a Chinese border town, carry it 300 miles to the next major oasis, and sell it to a different merchant at a profit. That second merchant would carry it another few hundred miles, sell it again, and return home. A single item might change hands dozens of times, passing through different languages, currencies, and cultures before reaching its final destination. And with every exchange, the price increased. By the time a length of Chinese silk reached the markets of Rome, it was astronomically expensive, an ultimate symbol of luxury and power. Silk was, of course, the most famous export moving from east to west. The Chinese had mastered the complex, laborious art of sericulture, harvesting the delicate threads produced by the silkworm, and they guarded the secret of its production with lethal intensity. The fabric was incredibly desirable in the West. It was lighter than wool, cooler than linen, and possessed a shimmering, almost magical quality that obsessed the Roman elite. It was so popular and drained so much silver from the Roman economy that the Senate repeatedly tried to ban it, citing both economic ruin and moral decay. The bans never worked, but silk was only one part of the story. Moving westward alongside the textiles were incredibly delicate porcelains, fragrant teas, and vital technologies. The Chinese invention of paper traveled along these routes, slowly making its way to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe, fundamentally changing how human knowledge was recorded and shared. Gunpowder, another Chinese invention, moved west with explosive consequences, forever altering the nature of warfare. In exchange, a massive flow of luxury goods and raw materials moved from west to east. From the Mediterranean came beautifully crafted glassware, a technology the Chinese had not yet mastered. The Romans exported vast quantities of gold and silver bullion to pay for their silk addiction. From the Baltic Sea, amber was transported down into Central Asia. From the high mountains of Bactrian came lapis lazuli, a stone of such brilliant blue that it was ground into pigment for the finest religious art. But perhaps the most highly prized import into China was not a stone or a metal, but an animal. The Han emperors were obsessed with securing a steady supply of what they called heavenly horses from the Fergana Valley. These horses were larger, faster, and stronger than the native Chinese breeds. They were essential for military campaigns against the nomadic cavalry of the steppes. The desire for these horses was so intense that the Chinese launched massive military expeditions simply to secure trade access to the Fergana breeders. They were willing to trade immense amounts of silk, not for luxury, but for the military advantage these magnificent animals provided. The journey of these precious goods, crawling at a painstaking pace across the continents, was punctuated by arrivals at some of the most extraordinary cities the ancient world had ever known. If the caravanserais were the isolated outposts of the Silk Road, the great cities were its beating heart. These were not merely places of commerce. They were the ultimate destinations where wealth, culture, and power accumulated in staggering proportions. At the eastern terminus of the network stood Chang'an, the imperial capital of the Tang dynasty, located near the modern city of Xi'an. During the 8th century, Chang'an was likely the largest and most populous city on the face of the earth, boasting a population that exceeded 1 million people. To a weary merchant arriving from the harsh deserts of the West, the sight of Chang'an must have been overwhelmingly magnificent. The city was laid out in a massive, perfectly organized grid, surrounded by towering, impenetrable walls of rammed earth that stretched for miles. Entering Chang'an was like stepping into a microcosm of the entire world. The city was strictly divided into two massive commercial districts: the East Market, which catered to the domestic needs of the local population, and the legendary West Market, which was the epicenter of international trade. The West Market was a sprawling, chaotic labyrinth of thousands of shops, warehouses, and stalls. Here, the sheer scale of the Silk Road's wealth was on full display. You could find Persian carpets woven with intricate geometric designs, massive blocks of uncut jade from Khotan, rare perfumes, and aromatic woods from Southeast Asia, and brilliant, unblemished pearls harvested from the Indian Ocean. The air in the West Market was a thick, intoxicating blend of roasting meats, exotic spices, and the constant, deafening roar of negotiation. The streets were crowded with a dizzying array of people. Sogdian merchants in their distinctive pointed hats haggled over the price of silk. Arabian traders, deeply tanned from the sea routes, discussed the fluctuating value of silver. Monks, mercenaries, diplomats, and entertainers from a dozen different empires rubbed shoulders in the crowded taverns. The Tang emperors actively cultivated this cosmopolitan atmosphere, welcoming foreigners and encouraging the flow of wealth and ideas that made Chang'an the glittering center of the Eastern world. Thousands of miles to the west, situated in the fertile valley of the Zarafshan River, lay another jewel of the Silk Road, the ancient city of Samarkand. While Chang'an was the seat of an immense empire, Samarkand was the quintessential oasis city, an independent powerhouse of commerce built by the Sogdians. If Chang'an was defined by its rigid imperial order, Samarkand was defined by its lush, almost overwhelming beauty. Approaching Samarkand from the arid steppes, a traveller would first see the sprawling, meticulously maintained gardens and orchards that surrounded the city. Fed by a complex system of irrigation canals, these green spaces provided a sharp, miraculous contrast to the surrounding desert, offering shade, fresh water, and the legendary fruits of the region, including golden peaches and incredibly sweet melons that were famous all the way to the Chinese court. Inside its high defensive walls, Samarkand was a city built entirely on the profits of trade. The architecture reflected the immense wealth of its merchant elite. Grand mansions were decorated with exquisite, detailed murals depicting scenes of hunting, religious ceremonies, and, fittingly, international diplomacy. The bazaars of Samarkand were legendary, acting as a massive sorting house for the goods flowing between east and west. It was here that Chinese silk was often unpacked, inspected, and then reloaded onto fresh caravans heading toward Persia and the Mediterranean. But Samarkand was also a center of profound intellectual and technological exchange. It was in cities like this that the transmission of crucial technologies occurred. When the secret of papermaking finally breached the borders of the Chinese Empire, it was in the workshops of Samarkand that the first major production centers in the Islamic world were established. The abundant water supply and the availability of flax and hemp allowed the artisans of Samarkand to perfect the craft, producing high-quality paper that was eventually exported westward, sparking a revolution in record-keeping, literature, and the administration of empires across the Middle East and Europe. These great cities, Chang'an, Samarkand, and dozens of others like Kashgar and Bukhara, were the anchors of the Silk Road. They provided the essential markets where goods could be liquidated, but more importantly, they provided the stable, vibrant environments where the true exchange of the ancient world took place. They were the physical proof that despite the lethal deserts, the freezing mountains, and the terrifying distances, humanity could build monuments to connection and mutual prosperity. Yet, for all the wealth generated by the exchange of silk and silver, the most enduring legacy of the Silk Roads was not physical cargo. It was the invisible cargo that traveled alongside the merchants. Ideas, philosophies, and faiths moved across the continents, carried by pilgrims, scholars, and ordinary travelers. The Silk Road was the primary artery for the spread of the world's major religions. It functioned as a massive, continental network of cultural cross-pollination. Buddhism, originating in the Indian subcontinent, found a fertile pathway along the trade routes. Buddhist monks regularly joined the large merchant caravans for safety as they traveled northward and eastward, carrying sacred texts and a message of spiritual liberation. As they moved through Central Asia, they did not just pass through. They settled. They built magnificent monasteries and carved intricate cave temples into the cliff sides of desert oases. The Mogao caves near Dunhuang stand today as one of the most breathtaking examples of this religious devotion. Over centuries, thousands of monks and artisans carved hundreds of caves into the soft rock, painting vivid murals and sculpting massive statues of the Buddha. These caves served as spiritual waypoints, places where exhausted travelers could stop, pray for a safe desert crossing, and leave behind offerings. Through this slow, organic movement of people, Buddhism established deep roots in China and eventually spread to Korea and Japan. Other faiths followed similar paths. Zoroastrianism, the ancient state religion of the Persian empires, spread eastward with Iranian merchants, finding adherents in the cosmopolitan cities of Tang Dynasty China. Nestorian Christianity, a sect deemed heretical by the Byzantine Church and expelled from the empire, moved steadily eastward. By the 7th century, Nestorian communities were thriving in Central Asia, and a famous stone monument discovered in the Chinese city of Chang'an provides undeniable proof that Christian congregations existed deep within the Chinese interior. Later, following the rise of the Islamic caliphates in the 7th century, Arab and Persian Muslim merchants began traveling the routes. Unlike the early forceful military expansions in the Middle East, the spread of Islam along the Silk Road was largely peaceful, carried by traders and Sufi mystics. Over generations, it displaced earlier religions to become the dominant faith across Central Asia, a legacy that remains firmly in place today. This massive religious diffusion did not happen in isolation. As faiths mingled, they brought with them a stunning exchange of artistic styles and architectural techniques. The Silk Road was a canvas where different cultures painted over and alongside each other, creating brilliant, hybridized forms of art. The classic image of the Buddha, for example, evolved significantly as it moved along the routes. In the region of Gandhara, located in modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, Buddhist sculptors incorporated Hellenistic techniques left behind by the armies of Alexander the Great. They carved statues of the Buddha wearing classical Greek drapery, a profound visual blending of Eastern philosophy and Western artistic tradition. Even the most iconic artistic products of a single culture often had hidden cross-cultural origins. When we think of classical Chinese art, we often picture exquisite blue and white porcelain. But this celebrated tradition was actually a direct result of Silk Road exchange. The white porcelain itself was a Chinese mastery, but the vivid cobalt blue dye used to decorate it was not native to China. It was imported by Muslim merchants from the Islamic world, specifically from regions in modern-day Iran. Islamic potters had used cobalt for centuries on their tin-glazed wares. When they introduced this pigment to the Chinese coastal cities, the local artisans adopted it, combining their superior firing techniques with the imported blue dye to create a style that would conquer the world. It was a perfect synthesis of two distinct artistic traditions meeting at the crossroads of commerce. Music, too, flowed freely across the borders. The Tang Dynasty in China was famous for its cosmopolitan atmosphere. and the imperial court was obsessed with the exotic sounds of the West. Musicians from Kashgar, Bukhara, and Samarkand were highly sought after. They brought with them new instruments, like the pear-shaped lute that eventually evolved into the Chinese pipa. Terracotta figurines from this period vividly depict foreign musicians with deep-set eyes and heavy beards riding on the backs of camels, their heads thrown back in song, capturing a moment of joyous cultural blending. The air of Chang'an, the eastern terminus of the routes, was filled with melodies that had traveled thousands of miles across the desert, while the overland routes across the deserts and mountains are the most famous. They were only one half of the story. Running parallel to the dusty caravan trails was a vast, entirely different network of trade that connected the world through a medium just as dangerous and unpredictable as the Taklamakan Desert. This was the Maritime Silk Road. It was a sprawling web of sea lanes that linked the coastal ports of East Asia to the islands of Southeast Asia, stretched across the Indian Ocean to the subcontinent, and reached all the way to the Arabian Peninsula and the eastern coast of Africa. If the Bactrian camel was the undisputed ship of the desert, the workhorse of the Maritime Silk Road was a literal ship, specifically the traditional sailing vessels known broadly as dhows. These ships were the backbone of the Indian Ocean trade for over 2 millennia. They were a profound feat of maritime engineering, constructed using techniques that seem almost impossibly fragile to modern eyes. Many ancient dhows were not held together by iron nails. Instead, their wooden planks were meticulously sewn together using incredibly strong natural fibers, like those extracted from coconut husks. The hulls were then sealed and waterproofed with thick pastes and oils derived from fish or sharks. Despite this seemingly delicate construction, these ships were incredibly resilient and capable of carrying massive loads. They featured distinct triangular sails, known as lateen sails, which provided exceptional maneuverability and allowed the sailors to navigate closer to the wind than the square-rigged ships of Europe. Navigating the Maritime Silk Road required an intimate, almost instinctual understanding of the natural world. The entire system of oceanic trade was dictated by the monsoon winds. These massive, seasonal weather patterns act like a giant, predictable engine driving the Indian Ocean. For half the year, the winds blow steadily from the southwest, pushing ships from the Middle East and Africa toward India and Southeast Asia. When the seasons shift, the winds reverse, blowing from the northeast, providing a natural, reliable return journey. The sailors of the dhows harnessed this immense natural power, riding the invisible currents across thousands of miles of open water. The maritime routes offered a significant advantage over the overland caravans. A single large merchant ship could carry a cargo volume that would require hundreds, if not thousands, of camels to transport by land. This made the sea routes incredibly lucrative, especially for heavy, bulky goods that were impractical to carry across mountains and deserts. The holds of these ancient ships were packed with massive quantities of raw materials and luxury items. They carried fragrant camphor, pungent spices from the Indonesian archipelago, massive loads of tea, and above all, ceramics. We know the sheer scale of this maritime trade not just from historical texts, but from the silent evidence resting at the bottom of the ocean. In the late 20th century, an astonishing discovery was made off the coast of Belitung Island in Indonesia. Divers found the wreck of an Arab dhow dating back to the 9th century. The ship had sunk over 1,000 years ago, but its cargo remained largely intact. When archaeologists brought it to the surface, they found a staggering 60,000 pieces of Chinese ceramics, carefully packed into large jars, alongside exquisite artifacts of gold and silver. This single shipwreck, frozen in time, perfectly illustrates the massive scale of the maritime trade network, proving that the exchange between Tang Dynasty China and the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East was robust, organized, and deeply interconnected. But the sea was just as merciless as the desert. Sailors on the maritime Silk Road faced a unique set of terrors. If the caravan merchants feared sandstorms and thirst, the sailors feared typhoons, jagged hidden reefs, and the chronic, terrifying threat of piracy. The narrow straits of Southeast Asia were particularly notorious for pirate attacks. A ship becalmed by failing winds was a sitting duck, vulnerable to sudden raids from heavily armed coastal fleets. And just like the desert travelers, the sailors existed in a state of profound isolation. Once a ship left port and the coastline dropped below the horizon, they were entirely alone, suspended in a vast blue void, relying entirely on their skill, the stars, and the mercy of the wind to survive the crossing. For centuries, the Silk Roads, both overland and maritime, operated as a decentralized, chaotic, and beautiful system of exchange. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted, and local warlords exacted their tolls. But the trade continued, driven by the sheer, unyielding human desire for profit and connection. But in the 13th century, the dynamics of the entire Eurasian continent changed with terrifying speed. Out of the high steppes of Central Asia rode a force that would conquer the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world: the Mongols. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol armies swept across the continent, crushing resistance and bringing an unprecedented, unified authority to a vast swath of the globe. From the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Eastern Europe, a single empire held sway. While the Mongol conquests were unbelievably brutal, the aftermath created a unique historical anomaly known as the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. For the first time in history, almost the entirety of the overland Silk Road was under the control of a single, highly organized administration. The Mongols, understanding the immense value of trade, actively encouraged and protected commerce. They established a sophisticated relay system known as the Yam, consisting of well-supplied horse stations situated every 30 to 40 kilometers across the empire. This system allowed for incredibly rapid communication, functioning like an ancient, high, speed postal service, and it provided a level of security and infrastructure for merchants that had never been seen before. The Pax Mongolica temporarily revitalized the overland routes. It was during this period of relative stability that a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo was able to make his legendary journey to the court of Kublai Khan. His detailed accounts of the East, chronicled in a book that captivated medieval Europe, fundamentally shifted the Western understanding of geography and fueled a deep, enduring obsession with Asian trade. The Mongol era was a brief, shining moment when the world felt smaller, more connected, and more accessible than ever before. But the very efficiency that made the Pax Mongolica so prosperous also carried the seeds of its own destruction. The unified trade networks that allowed silk, spices, and travelers to move so freely across the continent also provided a terrifyingly efficient conduit for something else: disease. The dark side of this unprecedented connectivity became horrifyingly clear in the 14th century. The Black Death, a pandemic caused by the bubonic plague bacterium, is widely believed to have originated somewhere in Central Asia or the Tibetan Plateau. It found its way into the massive, fast-moving networks of the Mongol Empire. It was carried by soldiers, merchants, and the fleas living on the rats that infested the grain stores and supply wagons. The plague moved along the caravan trails with devastating speed, striking the densely populated trade hubs and caravanserais. The devastation was absolute. As the disease swept westward, it collapsed the labor forces necessary to maintain the routes. Way stations were abandoned. Major oasis cities were decimated, turning bustling centers of commerce into ghost towns. The trade became too dangerous, not just because of bandits, but because the very act of interaction carried the threat of agonizing death. By the time the Black Death reached Europe, it had already critically wounded the infrastructure of the Silk Road. The massive loss of life severely weakened the Mongol Empire, contributing directly to its fragmentation and the eventual end of the Pax Mongolica. The decline of the Silk Road was not a single sudden event, but a slow, agonizing unraveling. The political stability shattered, and the routes were once again divided among warring factions and hostile states. The final, definitive blow to the overland trade came in the year 1453, when the Ottoman Empire conquered the city of Constantinople, effectively severing the primary land connection between Europe and Asia. The old roads were closed, but the desire for the goods of the East did not disappear. Cut off from the overland routes, European powers were forced to look elsewhere. Driven by the need to find new ways to access the lucrative spice and silk markets, they turned their attention to the sea. They began building ships capable of crossing the open ocean, initiating the Age of Discovery. It was the closure of the ancient Silk Road that pushed explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus out into the unknown, changing the map of the world forever. In a profound way, the end of the ancient caravan routes was the direct catalyst for the beginning of the modern global era. Today, the physical traces of the Silk Road are mostly gone. The caravanserais are crumbling ruins, returning slowly to the desert dust. The great merchant empires of the Sogdians are long forgotten. But the legacy of the networks is woven into the very fabric of our modern lives. Every time we eat an apple, a fruit that originated in the mountains of Central Asia and traveled west along the trade routes, we are experiencing a piece of that ancient history. Every time we read a printed book or hear a piece of music influenced by a distant culture, we are feeling the echoes of those courageous merchants who refused to accept that the world was too vast to cross. The Silk Road was never really about the silk. It was about the fundamental human urge to see what lies beyond the next mountain, to understand the people who live on the other side of the desert, and to bring back a piece of that distant world to our own. It was a testament to endurance, curiosity, and the profound belief that even the most formidable landscapes on Earth cannot keep us apart forever. As you lie here now, let the grand distances we have covered tonight begin to soften. The harsh deserts and the freezing mountain passes are far away. You are safe, and the long journey is coming to an end. Imagine the slow, steady rhythm of the camel caravan fading into the distance. The soft sound of the heavy bells ringing quietly in the cool night air, growing fainter and fainter until they are just a memory of a sound. Let the vastness of the world comfort you. The distances that once separated civilizations have been crossed. The difficult paths have been walked. There is nothing left for you to do tonight but rest. Feel the heaviness in your limbs. Let the quiet darkness of the night wrap around you, like a thick, warm blanket shielding you from the cold of the desert. Your breath is steady. Your mind is calm. The ancient merchants have stopped for the night. The fires in the courtyard are burning low, casting long, gentle shadows against the thick walls. The stories have been told, the goods have been safely stored, and a deep, peaceful silence has fallen over the world. Sleep now. Let the echoes of the ancient travelers guide you into a quiet, undisturbed rest. The horizon can wait for tomorrow. Tonight is only for peace. Good night.